We have a presentation on post-offer employment testing, short for POET. It's actually a great case study. One of our founding members, as a matter of fact, who has implemented it, they're going to be going through and walking us through the benefits of this, I guess, process or format, whatever you want to call it. But it's been quite amazing, the results. And Peter, if you don't mind going through the bios real quick.
Yep. We have, first of all, Justin Marquardt. He is the Executive Director of OHS National. They're a third-party administrator managing pre-employment and occupational health programs. And his colleague, Sean Shire, is a physical therapist by profession, but he spent the last 12 years in clinical operations management and business development. And lastly, one of our members, Julie Krug, is going to provide her insight on how the program has worked for Sunrise, and she is the Director of Risk Management and Privacy Officer for Sunrise. That's a big mouthful there. She's got a lot of hats, and we love her so much. So please come up here and...
Thank you. Clicker. Okay. Yep, sure. There we go.
Hello, I'm Justin Marquardt. I'm with OHS National. We are a third-party administrator for pre-occupational employment testing. It runs the gamut from drug screening all the way to physical performance testing. We've got clients all over the country, coast to coast, and one of the big things that we do is we build and provide medical networks that provide the testing locations and opportunities for our clients. We've been working with Sunrise Community for a number of years, been working with Zach and Julie and Sandra and the rest of the team down there. And a few months ago, Jennifer contacted me and asked me to come down and present a little bit about post-offer employment testing in the program that we have done for Sunrise Community. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the physical therapist that we rely on to develop a lot of these tests, and he's going to talk about exactly what a post-offer employment test is, the process of the testing in detail, and the benefits to the user client who decides to utilize this testing for their employee pool. Okay, Sean?
Well, I've got to explain something first before I get started. If you notice that I'm not moving my left arm very much, I dislocated it about a week ago doing physical performance testing. No, I'm kidding. The story is actually funnier than that. I wiped out on one of those electric scooter things that you rent with a phone app. So, yeah, that's going on. And I tell you that only because if you see me on an employment application for one of your companies that you represent, I'm going to get hurt in about 5 minutes if you don't have a performance testing program in place. So just keep that in mind. So I think most of us have some sense of what a physical performance test is, right? You know something about it. You've seen it in the literature, or you've maybe talked about it as an organization. This is my definition: a test in which an individual demonstrates the ability to perform physical functions that are objectively measured and represent the essential functions of the job description. Okay? So what I want you to do first is think about either a job or what an employee does in your work setting, or maybe one of your policy holders. Okay? Just take 15 seconds and think about what they're doing. All right? All right, I'll pick on people I know. Sandra, what did you imagine there? What?
So it's where, Sunrise from
Patient care type stuff, okay? Bent over a bed for a minute or two, working on a vent, right? Or, lifting and repositioning somebody in bed. Somebody else have anything they want to venture out there? Jobs that, what's something you pictured in your mind? Okay, all right. Goodwill? Yeah, oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, heavy lifting, right? Okay. Well, guess what? I can make a test that will simulate that stuff, and we can determine whether or not a person has the physical capabilities to do that work. And these tests include things like pushing, pulling, reaching to various heights, holding positions for sustained periods of time, like that patient care stuff that Sandra was talking about, balancing. Anything you can imagine, anything you just thought about there, I can make a test that simulates that, all right? These tests should include some type of medical screen that determines whether or not this person's safe to do this thing or not, this test, right? Because the people that provide these tests, they have a profit and loss just like you do, and somebody falling down with a heart attack or a dislocated shoulder is bad for business. So we want to make sure that they're medically safe to do the test at all. And some of these tests might also include some type of baseline measurement of the joints range of motion and the strength in their arms and legs and core strength, just so we have some sense of whether, again, they're safe enough to do the test, right? So why would you do it? Well, the obvious reason is preventing injuries, okay? Some of those jobs that you were imagining are pretty physical. And it'd be nice if you could do some type of a screen to hire people that are actually physically capable of doing it, right? Because that's a source of injuries for any business, especially the heavier lifting jobs and the high exertion category of jobs. Healthcare is one of the big injury rates, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. And then the other thing you've got to keep in mind with preventing work comp injuries is not just the person that can't do the work, but maybe their coworker, right? They might hurt somebody else because they can't hold up their end of the deal if it's some kind of a joint activity or somebody's picking up their slack. And I think the other reason to do it is, I've been doing this a long time as a physical therapist, and I think in the 90s when I started treating injured workers, people just kind of viewed workers' compensation as a cost of doing business, right? You guys know that. And I think companies have figured out that they need to prevent injuries, they need to be safe working environments for their employees. It's good for business, it drops straight down to the bottom line. And this is just another tool in the toolbox for a safe workplace. Injury rates. I think the best place to look at this when you're deciding whether you should do something like this is your own injury data, okay? And it's dirt simple to look at your injury data and compare it to an industry standard. You just go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? And just to give you some sense, hospital workers and nursing home workers, they have the highest rates of all. Okay, 6% is really high. It's expressed as 6 per 100 injuries, or 6 per 100 employees. So a 6% injury rate for hospitals, super high. Healthcare workers in general is 4. Warehousing and storage is 5. So that's a little bit like the Goodwill donation thing that you were talking about, right? My daughter loves shopping at Goodwill in Lawrence, Kansas, so we go there a lot, and I see it. Construction, for comparison, is half of a hospital worker. And this is something, this struck me in a journal article I read years ago, coal mining. The article asserted that it was more dangerous to working in a nursing home than it did a coal mine. And I'm unlike my Facebook friends, I fact check stuff. I'm like, that's not right. And sure enough, 2.6 compared to 6. Unless you're in a cult, you want to make sure that you're having some conflict with business decision making, right? Some pushback. There's concerns with this. We run into this when I'm consulting with employers about whether or not to consider doing performance testing. And for the HR folks in the room, I think we worry about discrimination with any type of selective test, right? I think we worry about if you're in operations, like I've been most of my career, if we've already got a thin applicant pool, do we really want to filter this even further? Think about if you're in the nursing home industry. That's a big deal. It's something we worry about. Bean counters care about cost, and they should. And there's people that have to administer a program like this. They've got to schedule the test. They've got to collect the data results. They've got to decide whether the employee can start and go through onboarding. And so they worry about a program like this just adding to the other stuff that we've got to do to get this employee hired. So I think the first thing to do is take a look at return on investment. That's probably the bottleneck, and you've got to get past that before you move forward with it. And when I'm first talking to an employer about a program like this, I do this very simple formula. I say, all right, if you could prevent one injury, look at your average claim costs. What are we talking here? I've just made these numbers up, but let's say your average claim cost is $40,000 for a work comp injury, and a test costs $200. You could do 200 tests and pay for that one injury that you prevented, okay? And so for an employer that maybe extends 85 conditional job offers a year, it's kind of a no-brainer, okay? But you're still kind of accepting on faith that even one injury is going to be prevented. I think another cost savings that you need to look at, and talk to your insurance carrier, because there may be, in the general work comp, maybe not specifically in this segment of the insurance industry, there may be some cost savings, okay? I know that I have 2 teenagers that just started driving and our car insurance went way up. And so the insurance company's going to have me put some app on my phone that tracked how fast I drove. And there's no way I was going to do that. So but I could have saved some money, right? And this is something that could save some money on your work comp insurance too. The other thing that I think, if you haven't done a lot of research on this early on and you're still in the early stages, there's often this conception that you have to test everybody. Now, you just have to test the high injury jobs. You probably wouldn't get much value of doing a POET program if you've got a receptionist that's just sitting and answering the phone and on a computer. And so you don't have to test those job categories. You just have to identify the jobs that you view to be high risk and high injury rates, and then you have to test everybody that applies for that job. And actually not even applies, that has applied for the job and you've extended a conditional job offer. That's an important distinction. Kind of misspoke there. The other thing you have to take a look at is it's not just the injuries, right? There's a lot of indirect costs associated with people that aren't physically capable of doing this work. Certainly, if you have some physical shortcomings and you've got a physical job, you're not going to work as fast, as efficiently, right? These people tend to be sore, and they call in sick. I managed a hospital PT department for a while, and PTs are just the lifting goons in a hospital, and I'm sure that my staff had sore backs a lot, but they never called in sick because of that. It's like, I've got the flu, and you get this, feeble voice on the phone, but that's how this works. I mean, patients or employees that are struggling with doing the work tend to call in sick a lot. And then there's another term that we consider, and that's presenteeism. That's the employee that's just kind of sandbagging it while they're at work, or letting somebody else do more of the physical work while they kind of hold back. It's not laziness, it's just they're kind of protecting themselves, right? And that's bad for workplace morale, which can have its own costs. It leads to turnover, right? And then you've got to hire somebody else, and that costs. And then the other thing I always say is there is that tendency to rely on their coworkers to do some of this stuff. Yeah? And so, those are the indirect costs that you have to consider, and they're a little bit harder to quantify than just your claims costs. For the people that have to do the administration of this, there's a simple solution here, and that's outsource it, because these are labor-intensive things to start and manage. You've got to schedule these tests, you've got to collect data, you've got to get the results, you have to report the results to somebody else within your organization, and if you can outsource this to a company that will do most of that legwork for you, you're going to save money too, at least at the costs of the program. There's other benefits that have been shown in the long-term care industry. I think that's a segment of the workforce that this is pretty typical in. There's been a recognition in long-term care that these are dangerous jobs, and this is a pretty well-accepted business solution. And, when they do studies on this thing, or when they do, and we're going to talk about this here in a minute, they're definitely demonstrating a decrease in work-related injury risk, decreased costs, decreased turnover, better productivity, better quality of care, better morale. And, all of that stuff drops down to your bottom line, right? Some specific studies, there was a study showed that new hires that passed a POET had a 41% reduction in injuries and a 21% higher retention. It's a published study. If you look at Bureau of Labor statistics, again, a CNA in a nursing home, that is a dangerous place to be as an employee. Okay. There's a journal article in the journal Work that said POET reduced injuries in nursing homes by 90%. I don't know what the N on that study was. I want to look at that a little bit more closely. And then this is the one that I think is compelling because I like numbers. I'm a specific guy. This company looked at CNAs for the year before they implemented the POET program and their measurable work comp costs, and then after for a year. And the total cost difference, the delta, was almost $90,000. And what they spent for the POET program that first year was about $14,000. So it's a 6-to-1 return on investment. Not bad, right? I'm not going to say much about this because Julie's going to be talking about this and sharing the detail of it. But we've got this guy in Kansas City called Patrick Mahomes. You know him? You know who that guy? We love that guy in Kansas City, where I'm from. Look at that. 3 injuries. Yeah, okay. 3 injuries reported from the POET pool versus 98 from non-tested employees. All right, that's when Patrick Mahomes throws one of those ridiculous touchdown passes, they just show him over on the sidelines. You know? So that's kind of like that slide, and she's going to talk a little bit more about this here in just a bit. Bickford Senior Living, this is another nursing home program that I was involved in at the very front end of it, developing the program. And sometimes employers don't like to put their specific costs up there, but for sure, I mean, this is a big end, all right? 2,500 POETs over the last 5 years, and they've had a reduction in costs per injury, a reduction in injuries in tested pool, and an increased retention. So, that's an actual company that you can talk to and get the results and the efficacy of this. So, how do you go about doing this? And from here on out, if you have any questions, pipe up, okay? Because this is kind of linear, and I want to make sure you understand step A before we get to step B and step C. I've been a teacher. I teach in the PT program, so you can't distract me. I know what to do. So just raise your hand if you have anything that I haven't made clear. So here's the progression of things that have to happen. And, my goal here, my job today is to make you guys informed consumers, okay? I want you guys to understand how this works. You may have a general understanding of it, but, if you're talking to a vendor or talking to a provider, I want you to understand what these best practice steps are. Okay? So the first step is getting a job description that's accurate and that's thorough and that has very specific force and lifting and pushing and pulling requirements. You can't guess here if you don't want this thing to be discriminatory or accurate. These have to be very precise. The next step, and this is a test question, okay? Like my PT students, this is a test question. If you're not directly involved with the employer as a provider, you're doing it wrong, okay? Because only the employer knows specifically what the job nuances are. It's a collaborative effort, and I always make sure that employers that I work with understand that I'm going to be asking a ton of questions. Okay, so then you take the physical performance test and base it on the job description. And the thing about this, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, you don't have to test everything, okay? You have to define about 8 to 12 essential functions of the job. And then you want to do a pilot test, okay? You want to make sure that you test some people that are familiar with that work before you implement the program and make sure they say, this seems about right. Because it won't be exactly the same stuff that they're doing at work. We simulate everything, but we do want to make sure that we validate the test before we just push it downhill, okay? And then the last thing is, just don't start it and go off and leave it. You want to track data. You want to look at whether it worked or not. You're paying money for it, right? You want to make sure that you're managing the demographics of who's passing and failing it. I haven't talked to the HR folks yet, but I'm getting ready to. That kind of matters. That whether there's a protected class that's being affected in some way different from the general test population. So, job evaluation. I think it's important to have somebody from outside your organization come and do it for you. Because, you know, here's the thing. If you ask me what color the walls are in my house, I have no idea. Okay, my wife's painted it a couple times. I know. I don't even remember when she did it. I'm too close to it. I'm not paying any attention. So I think it's good to have somebody with an outside set of eyes come into your work setting and take a look at what these things have to do. There's a lot of value in that. I also think that there's some legal insulation. If you've had somebody else come out and measure this stuff, if the test ever does get challenged, I think it's important to demonstrate that somebody else came out and took a look at this stuff. It wasn't just us reporting these job requirements. And then this is kind of a thing. I think this is interesting. If you ask managers how hard a job is, they kind of underreport it. If you ask employees how hard a job is, they kind of make it sound worse. Right? And I'll give you a specific example of this. I was doing a job evaluation on a construction site in Kansas City, and I asked the managers what the heaviest thing these guys have to lift out here is. They said, there's some bags of cement that weigh 50 or 60 pounds. I'm like, all right. So I put this down in my notes, and then I was asking one of the employees, and he said, oh yeah, these bags of cement, they weigh 100 pounds. Well, the bag of cement has 80 pounds written on the package. I don't know how nobody knows this, but you know, this is kind of a tendency. I've seen it before, and I think it's good to have somebody else come out here and just be Switzerland on the job description and just find out what it really is and get it recorded. I think it's important to do a general walkthrough of the job site for context. Okay? You should be wary of a provider that goes out in your work setting for half an hour and comes back and says, well, I got everything I need, let's go. No, there's a lot of stuff to look at, okay? And I want to talk to employees when I'm out on site. It's important to objectively measure. You've got to base your testing on an actual weight or a height or a distance they have to walk, right? You can't, because that's the only way to create the test element. I had one time I was competing with another provider to get a bid on a project, and what I was told by the company was, well, the guy wasn't weighing anything. You know, I go out with a tape measure and a bathroom scale and some things to take objective measurements, right? This guy was just going around picking things up and estimating what they weighed. And actually, I won't get into the methodology of his test, but they're only testing to job categories. They're not even testing to the specific weight amount. So I kind of understood it, but the optics of that are just terrible, right? You've got employees looking here. You know, what are we basing this stuff on? So make sure that they're comprehensive in their write-up, that even though you may not test everything that we measure, you want to get all of the data there because you're going to use that job description for other stuff. And then again, you know, when you're done and I present it to an employer, we go through it line by line and make sure we got it right. Some things to be wary of. I don't like using the employer's job description, but sometimes you'll have an insurance carrier do it for you and they've had an industrial hygienist come out. I'm fine with that. You know, I want to look and see what the basis of it is. I've also, and I'm not kidding about this, I was handed at a leather tannery a piece of Big Chief notebook paper that had 5 things that their employees had to do, weight-wise, handwritten. You know? And actually it was surprisingly accurate, but, you know, I stay away from that. And you can also use the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and that's okay, but it's not specific to your employment, and I think it's probably better to make sure that you're looking at the specific measurements. So next thing is you develop the test. Okay, so I'll give you an example of what maybe wouldn't be on a test, right? Let's say you've got a leaky roof, and an employee has to take out a 5-gallon bucket of water from the leak. You know, how often do they do that? That's not an essential function of the job. So the job description will go out and look at the things that they really do have to do. The patient care, or the accepting the donations and what those might weigh. So we identify the things that really demonstrate the most heavy thing that they have to lift, the longest distance they would have to carry something and how much, how long they have to hold a position, right? Those are the pass points for this test. And it's got to be specific, you know, and I'm going to be, if you fudge on it a little bit, that's where the discrimination and the fairness of the testing and some of those things kind of bleed into this, and you don't want that. So here's an example. The test criteria. If you look at a POET test, it says lift 45 pounds from 4 to 36-inch shelf. Well, what we saw out on the work site was the employee lifts a 5-gallon bucket of paint that weighs 45 pounds to the highest allowed shelf per storage policy of 36 inches. Right? That's the essential function of the job. And then we can make a test element where they take a lifting box and lift 45 pounds to 36 inches, and if they can do it, they pass, and if they can't, they don't. Simple. Another example, sustained trunk flexion while performing fine motor tasks for 2 minutes. And 2 minutes is the measurable part of this test criteria, right? And in job description says employee must bend at the waist while performing suctioning and respirator maintenance activities at bedside for periods of time up to 2 minutes. That's the stuff that we've gone out there and measured. It doesn't, we didn't see a single example of that taking longer than 2 minutes when we collected this data. So they have to be able to do this with a stopwatch on, right? So that's how you correlate the test with the job description. Next step is validation. Some testing methodologies have you bring in 2 or 3% of the test, or the total employee workforce. I think if you've got 4,500 employees, that's kind of onerous. But I think it's important to bring 4 or 5 people in, even 3 or 4 that are familiar with the job. They've done it and they know what the work is, and make sure one of them is a manager. So you offset those 2 biases as much as anything. But you just want employees who are familiar with the work, because they're the ones that are going to tell me, like, yeah, this seems about right. Yeah, this amount of weight that I'm having to lift is consistent with that bucket of paint that was the heaviest thing that I had to lift. When I go out and look at these things, I think it's important to understand, this is one of the things people worry about a little bit. I go out and I don't see the work activity that you guys described to me. I see a straight line with an arrow and a F equals, N, and that can be represented as weight or newtons or whatever. We measure it as weight from point A to point B, which is some distance, displacement. So there's a physics to this that make these simulated work activities, for all intents and purposes, the thing that the employee would have to demonstrate, not the actual work itself. I mean, it's not practical to have somebody come in here and, we can't bring in a fake patient and have them transfer them. We have to come up with ways to simulate that activity in one of these tests. There are times when we have a hard time simulating, okay? An example I can give you, we had a trucking company, and the heaviest thing that they had to lift when we measured it was this big tarp that weighed like 70 pounds, but it was huge, and they had to put it up on their shoulder and carry it around the truck. So we couldn't simulate that with a lifting station. So we just got a tarp. And the PTs there hated this big dirty thing in their clinic. It didn't match their decor, but bummer, man. We want to do right by our client. Once everybody agrees that this is a representative and valid representation of what the employee has to do, now you can implement it. But don't skip this step. All right? It's important to document this too from a legal standpoint. As far as the provider itself, PTs, OTs, therapists, we're trained in body mechanics, and one of the things that's important to understand is we're not just measuring whether this person can horse 75 pounds up to waist height. We want to make sure they can do it with good body mechanics and safely. Okay? So it's important to have people that are trained in body mechanics to be doing these tests. I will say some providers use medical assistants with training and credentialing, and I think it's okay. My caveat with these providers is maybe do it back in the PT department where they can keep an eye on you while you're doing the test, but my preference is to have a therapist do these tests. Make sure that there's dedicated equipment. I had a provider one time kind of MacGyver something to do linear force measurements with a weight stack in his PT clinic. And, from a physics standpoint, okay, I'll accept that was close, but you can do better. And for $200, they bought a push-pull sled, and they did a better job of simulating that work activity, okay? Make sure that they're measuring the blood pressure and pulse, because here's one of the things that you might be asking yourself. What about, sure, they can do this in a test for 20 minutes, but can they do this work for 8 hours? It's a valid question, right? I hope you're asking it. Well, cardiovascular health is measured with heart rate and blood pressure. So if we've got a test subject and we'll put a heart rate monitor around their chest, and if their heart rate goes over 150 beats a minute, that's telling us two things. Either they're in pain or they're really struggling with this, and they're not going to be able to do this for a sustained period of time. We stop the testing and it's a fail. Same with blood pressure. There's a maximum blood pressure that they're allowed to proceed with the testing, and we don't do it if they're over that. It needs to be a one-on-one patient counter. If the testing provider's got a stroke patient rolling around on a mat next to the test, your employee, potential employee, that's not good, because we're really having to look at body mechanics. And you need to have access to a supervising physician for this thing, because we're going to medically clear these people to do this test. And that needs to come from a physician, not a PT. Okay? You've got to gradually increase the weight. If the lifting requirement is 100 pounds, we don't want to just stick 100 pounds of weight in a box and say, get after it. They build up to it, because we want to make sure that they're capable of doing the test safely. We want to make sure that they're demonstrating good body mechanics. And if you've got a test program already, or if you're familiar with this, if you've got a really low fail rate, make sure that the people that are delivering the test are keeping a close eye on body mechanics, because I think that's the thing that they'll sometimes let a patient slide by, is kind of that shaky lift where they're not lifting it with their legs. And they shouldn't be commenting much about your employment or program. They should just tell the test subject you passed or you failed, and that's the end of it. We don't commiserate with an employee, a prospective employee that didn't pass the test. About 15 till give me the high sign. Okay, I want to make sure I leave you some room. I think sometimes it always seems like it's the construction guys. Well, how come we didn't have a bunch of people fail? Like, well, a fail rate actually, if you've done it right, it should be pretty low. I mean, there's a couple of tendencies here. One, a lot of the people that wouldn't have passed this test, they already know, right? I mean, I'm a PT. Do you think I'd have any business applying for a PT job in a nursing home with my shoulder? I'm not going to be able to do that work for 12 weeks. So, you can trust that employees kind of self-select, and sometimes they find out that there's a physical performance test, and Justin's got some data on this. They just don't show up. All right, so they haven't failed the test. It's not showing up in your data as a fail, but it's accomplished the same thing, right? It's kept an employee that doesn't have the physical capabilities of doing the work from winding up in your workforce. So that's a less measurable outcome. But you got to track all this stuff to know whether your program has value. And there's another reason why you have to track all this. All right? And that's, you don't want a discriminatory test. And so, are you familiar with the term disparate impact? Something that affects one group of people more than another. There's a very famous case called the Dial case, and that's why HR folks tend to be so spooked about these programs. I thought Dial was Dial soap for about a year or two when I was doing this, but actually it's a meatpacking plant, and of all places it was in Fort Madison, Iowa, and I lived right where this was happening, 5 miles down the river at the time. But the deal is this in a nutshell. They implemented a POET test program, or whatever it was called, a physical performance test, and all of a sudden women started failing this test. And the thing that they were having to demonstrate and failing was lifting this 65-pound bar to a 72-inch height, and it was 65 pounds of sausage, which I think is hilarious imagery, but so they had to hang these sausage racks up on this 6-foot-high hook or something. Well, what they didn't account for in developing the test is they had a platform. It wasn't some rickety step stool, but it was a thing that they could step up on to reach this thing, which is fine. I mean, that's accommodating it for somebody that's a little bit shorter, but they didn't measure that. The correct test element would have been from the top of that platform to the 72-inch thing, which would have been like 64 inches or whatever. So that was the first mistake. And then the other thing is, they were only hanging these meat racks once an hour, but whoever put the test together said they had to demonstrate this 8 times, because over the course of the day they had to hang the meat rack 8 times. But It's not the right number of reps, it's 1. So, they were doing the testing wrong, and they got sued for a bunch of money, and then everybody got kind of squirrely about doing performance testings. This test, or this issue, to me just shows it's important to do the job description right, okay, and collaboratively, because I'm sure if somebody would have told this test provider, well, they've got a platform that they stand on sometimes, they wouldn't even gotten this position. You have to test everybody for each job title. You can't do the gimpy-looking ones, all right, or the little ones, or the older ones, right? You have to test everybody. You don't have to test your entire organization, just the jobs that you decided to do. You need to track pass-fail rates for that disparate impact, and if you have an outsourced third-party vendor for these, they'll do that for you and send you a report. It's important data to collect. And I think it's important to understand that these essential job functions that they have to pay, they are what they are. If you're accurate and if you've done it correctly and you've got a well-documented diligence attached to your program, it is what it is. You will see women and older folks tend to be the ones that fail these things just because of strength as much as anything. All you should be getting for results reporting is a pass-fail. All right, there's no reason to get something else. Now, we do have, it's okay, there's nothing illegal about getting the whole test sent to you, but here's what you have to be careful about if you do. What if you got a test that showed Sean was able to do everything but the 65-pound sausage rack thing, but he was able to lift 55 pounds? You might say, we really like that guy in the interview, let's just hire him. Because the test provider has no idea what happens to that person after they leave the facility. It's still your hiring decision, right? So you don't want tempted with the results, because you might have somebody that was awful close. But guess what? You hire Sean, and then the next one that comes along the line is in a protected class, and you decide not to accommodate that. Now you've got a discriminatory test program, right? So I think getting the results is a bad idea, but it's not wrong or non-compliant. It's just my recommendation. You shouldn't be getting the medical history form. You shouldn't be hearing from your client, well, Sean couldn't do the test, his blood pressure was too high. That's just, you don't want to hear that, right? And then the provider should be retaining the records. We treat these as medical records, and if you need that information for any reason down the road, you should be able to get it produced by whoever's doing your testing. There are some collateral benefits to this that I think are important to understand, and the health history screening is a big one, okay? Can you ask somebody in a job interview if they have a dislocated shoulder? Can you see it on me? Would you know if you were sitting across a conference room table? You can't. You shouldn't ask, right? But we don't want the person getting hurt in the test, so we do have to ask. We're not going to tell you the specifics of what they tell us, but we're going to do a comprehensive health history screen that is not designed to determine whether they can do the job or not. It's designed to tell whether they can do the test. You see the distinction there? But that's pretty valuable information because we had a patient one time that had epilepsy, and part of he had to climb up on top of a ladder and walk on a catwalk for his employer. You think that's a great idea? What are the likelihood of that guy having an epileptic seizure during the POET test? It's pretty minimal. But we knew that he had epilepsy. We called the physician that was treating him and said, is this guy safe to be on ladders and catwalks? No, he shouldn't be doing that. And so he didn't get cleared to do the test. And we just saved that guy falling off of a grain elevator, right? It's not about the work comp costs there, it's about safety. So that's another thing. You see your pass-fail rate 2 or 3%, like, should we have screened more? Well, this is another source of people that don't get through that filter and into your workforce that's valuable by having a program in place. The other thing, this is an example I always like to give about the process. I was at a facility that made those metal grain silo buildings, and one of the things I stumbled across doing the job evaluation was these guys were storing these 80-pound beams, 85-pound beams in these rafters, and they were balancing on this 18-inch catwalk while they're doing it. It was pretty impressive, actually. I'm not sure I could have done it. So, I'm like, why are you doing that? I'm like, well, it's just where we have to put them. They can't be on the ground. So we get back to risk management. I say, this looks sketchy to me. Why are you doing this? She goes, they didn't even know they were. So it was simple. They just put a shelf for these beams on the side of that workspace, and they engineered safety into the job. We didn't have a test element for that company that said the patient or the employee had to bench press 85 pounds up onto a rafter. We got rid of it. And I think it's important to note that doing that one thing took the lifting requirements for this job, because it was highly automated and forklift driving and stuff like that, from 85 pounds overhead to like 30 pounds. It became a medium category job by addressing that one thing. That's why the process is just as important as the tests themselves, right? Is Florida, are pre-existing conditions compensable in Florida work comp? I don't know. Second injury? In Kansas and Missouri, they aren't, okay? So, when we test that baseline range of motion and strength, as I said, there's nothing about that measurement that would say whether an employee could do this stuff or not. We're just collecting data to make sure they're safe to do the testing. But if you've got somebody with a difference in shoulder region, which is almost, and now you know what their baseline status was at the time of their hire, yeah, it might help you with a work comp claim. Certainly it'll help you with case management work comp claim, because you know what that employee had as far as movement and strength before you hired them. That's your only obligation as an employer in work comp in most state jurisdictions, is just get them back to whole, whatever that was at the time that they took your job. The other thing I think that you probably understand conceptually is somebody that's got a crunchy old shoulder, like me, they're more likely to get hurt worse than if this had happened to me when I was 20, all right? And there's nothing about being 50 that's inherently means I've got a bad shoulder, right? But, I've had some other, I'm a mountain biker. I've goofed this thing up a couple other times too. What can you say? These patients that have some pre-existing shoulder instabilities or arthritis or a bad back, those claims are so much more expensive, aren't they? They've got surgery now attached to them, or they've got a lengthy amount of PT. So, the test program, it helps reduce your costs, not just by the number of injuries, but by how much each injury costs. It can be used as a return-to-duty test. Okay, let's say that you have a guy that dislocates his shoulder on an electric scooter and he's got a heavy lifting job. You want to just send that guy back to work when he thinks he's ready? Use your test. And that's the criteria for returning to work. Yeah, and I've said it before. I think that this globally, as an organization, it promotes your workplace safety. It demonstrates to the employees that, we care enough about this that we're going to screen this on the front end. We're trying to protect all of you guys. I think you'd be surprised to find that, most employees don't view this as something that's out to get them. For one thing, they're already hired, so I don't care. But it's not viewed negatively by your workforce. You can trust me on that. I think that that's true. So, any questions?